Okay, we'll just give this a minute for people just to join here. Oh, wow. A lot of people came in already. That's great. The link is working. We'll just give it a minute if that's okay, Nicole, for everyone to kind of sort out any technical issues. But it looks like things are going to work for people. Things are pretty good. Okay, people are coming in. I'm just going to do a brief introduction for our speaker today, for everyone that's joining us. Segon, Sewagwegon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second annual Student Science Indigenous Scientist Chats. My name is Jenna Barnhart, and I am the Indigenous Research Assistant for Student Science. If this is your first time hearing about us, we are a subsidiary initiative launched out of Ryerson University with their Sci Exchange program in 2019. And our objective has been to promote science outreach, science knowledge mobilization, and knowledge translation combined with traditional Indigenous teachings and Indigenous student outreach. So throughout the years, myself and the Indigenous Knowledge Outreach coordinator, Amber Sandy, who couldn't join us today, but she will be joining us on our subsequent chats. We've been working hard to offer science outreach programming, specifically to Indigenous youth. So if you're interested in hearing more about our past or future programming, you can find us all on social media platforms at Sci Exchange RU, which is written here on the slide, or our website, and you can just Google Ryerson University Sci Exchange, and the Indigenous Outreach link is here as well. So for today's program, we have graciously been able to partner with our friends at Let's Talk Science to provide this lovely webinar platform. And we're so excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Nicole Muir, to talk to us today about traditional Indigenous medicines and their teachings or healings, or her experience in psychology, Indigenous institution and education, and all sorts of topics that she has a wide breadth of experience in. And Dr. Nicole Muir is a member of the Métis Nation, and she's currently a psychology professor at York University. But I'll let her tell you more about her background and her experience and everything. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Muir, and I'll let you share your screen for us.
All right. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great that you could all come today. It is a Saturday and it is nice weather outside, so I'm very happy that you all showed up. So what I'm going to talk today about is a couple different things. I'm going to talk about addressing the impacts of colonialism on health disparities in Indigenous communities, using Indigenous community partnered research and why that's important. I'm also going to talk about some of the different ways that Indigenous psychologists can further the field. And also I'm going to talk about how you can yourself can become a psychologist. So I'll give you hopefully some ideas where to start looking, and where to start applying if you want to go and get maybe a PhD in psychology. So I'm going to start with how I got here. So I'm going to give you an idea of my career path, which was a little bit different than most people's. but I think that it shows you that there are other ways to get to a PhD in psychology than just going straight into university and then at 27, perhaps getting your PhD. I'm going to talk about Indigenous people and psychology in general and some of the things that we need to look for and how doing psychology with Indigenous people is different than in the past, and also how doing psychological research with Indigenous people should be with them as opposed to on them research in the past. I'm going to talk about a few of the different research projects that I've done so you can get an idea of some of the work that you could do if you became a psychologist. And finally, I'm going to talk about some questions. There'll be time at the end for questions. So first of all, I want to start with I am Métis. My family, my grandfather was born in Red River in Manitoba. So right now, I actually don't have a Métis card. I'm applying through Manitoba for various reasons, but I won't get into it now. Before I started working, so in my early 20s, I got undergraduate degrees in both education and then English literature. I actually thought that I was going to be a teacher. That was kind of my plan in high school. But what I ended up doing instead of working in the classroom was working in kind of social services work. So I was an FASD worker in Williams Lake, British Columbia. So I educated students in school and different social workers, teachers, parents about how to prevent FASD. Then I was a special needs consultant in the Downtown Eastside in Vancouver. So I worked with families to help support their children that had special needs. And I was also an ESL teacher, English as a second language. So, oftentimes people think, well, how can that contribute? How could that job help you? But that job really helped me because I worked with students from countries all over the world. So I learned a lot about culture and cultural differences. In 2008, I started working at Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. I was a family home visitor. So I worked with families to try to keep their children safely at home. Then in 2009, I moved to Anishinaabe Health Toronto, which is an Indigenous health unit. And there I started as an addictions counselor. So I worked with Indigenous adults who wanted support around their addictions. And then I moved to become a traditional counselor. So there I started using Western counseling techniques alongside of traditional Indigenous. So for instance, I would support my clients around going to see an elder. I would, smudge with my clients if they wanted to. So that was the first time I really combined Indigenous ways of healing with more Western ways of healing. So then I decided in 2013, I was 37 years old. I decided, no, actually I was 40 when I started my master's. I decided, it was a hard decision for me to quit work and go back to university because there's a lot of questions like, will I have enough money? Will I be able to do it? But I decided that I had to try. So I started my master's in clinical child psychology at Simon Fraser University. And because I thought I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. But then as I was doing the clinical work, I realized, no, I really like research. So for my PhD, I actually switched to forensic psychology. And forensic psychology is basically anywhere that mental health and the justice system interact. And actually, it was a really good decision because we know the populations I'm interested in are youth in foster care and youth in the justice system. And we know that a lot of Indigenous people are involved in both systems or were involved in both systems. So it was very useful for me to learn more about the justice system. After I finished my PhD, I moved back to Toronto where I did a postdoctoral fellow in public health. So a postdoc is basically an added 2 years of your education. So you're not taking classes, but what you're doing is you're working with a different researcher. And for me, it was Dr. Janet Smiley, where I was learning different things that I could have learned at Simon Fraser. So at Simon Fraser, my supervisors were not Indigenous. But when I went to Well Living House, Janet Smiley is Métis Cree, and she's a world-class researcher in Indigenous research or community partnered research. So I learned a lot about how to do community partnered research. And then in 2022, so just 2 months ago, I started at York University as an assistant professor. So I'm in the clinical developmental department with a specialization in Indigenous mental health or mental wellness. So as you can see, I kind of took a different path. I did a lot of frontline work where I gained a lot of work experience. So actually, when I was in university, I found that having some work experience in the real world really helped me with my classes, really helped me understand the material, and really helped me to understand what was important for me to learn. So I'm going to talk about some different aspects of Indigenous people and psychology. So I'm going to talk about past and current research in psychology. I'm going to talk about colonialism as a context for psychology, because that is a piece that is really missing from psychology today. I'm going to talk about the importance of having reliable data. And Our Health Counts is a research project that I worked on. I'm going to talk about Indigenous community partnered research. And the example I'm going to use there is the Doje Mino Nasewana, which is an Indigenous COVID testing and support center. I'm then going to talk about a little bit of the research that I did during my PhD. So it was intervention research in forensic psychology. So I really am looking at colonialism and the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. So why are there so many Indigenous people in the justice system? And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to become a psychologist. So I think it's really important to understand that colonialism is the background for psychology. It is the context. I think what happens is a lot of non-Indigenous psychologists, they don't understand how colonialism affects us as Indigenous people. So this is a quote I really like by Alfred. He is at University of Victoria and he's Indigenous. And he says that, you know, most people, when they think about colonialism, they think about residential schools, they think about land loss, racism, welfare dependency, and all of those things certainly are colonialism. But what most people don't realize is that colonialism affects the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people. So that's what I wanted to study. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about reliable data and why it's important. So there's three main reasons why reliable data is important. So one of the reasons, the first reason is funding. So let's say, for example, in the city of Toronto, the city thinks that there are 20,000 Indigenous people. And the reason they think that is because they use the census from Statistics Canada. So, but in fact, because some Indigenous people choose not to do the census, and other Indigenous people may not have an address, a home address, so they're not included in the census, or they move around so often that they're missed in the census. But if the city only gives us funding for 20,000 Indigenous people, but in fact there are 40,000 Indigenous people, then that means we're not going to have enough services. And it's also going to affect policy. So it's really important that we know how many Indigenous people are in Canada, in the cities, in communities. And it's also really important that Indigenous people themselves do the research and collecting. And there's a couple different reasons for that. So the Our Health Counts Toronto is an excellent study that was done by Dr. Janet Smiley at Well Living House with the community partner 7th Generation Midwives, which is an Indigenous midwifery center. And the reason that Our Health Counts is such a great study is because the study was done by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. So we had Indigenous community members who we trained to do the interviews with Indigenous people. We also had the Indigenous community in Toronto decide which questions were important for us to know. So the important questions from the community were on the survey. And also the other thing that we did was we asked Indigenous people to self-identify. So sometimes Indigenous people will not self-identify, will not say that they're Indigenous to non-Indigenous people because they don't feel safe. But with Our Health Counts, we had Indigenous people doing the survey. So we asked participants, do you identify as Indigenous? And if they said yes, they were included in the survey. And this way we know that everyone in our survey was Indigenous. So one of the things that we found with Our Health Counts Toronto is that the Indigenous population in Toronto is actually 2 to 4 times larger than reported by the census by Stats Canada. So in 2016, the Canadian census estimated that there are about 23,000 Indigenous people in Toronto. But in fact, using some new fancy statistics and by focusing specific questions on this, we estimate that in 2016, there are 54,000 to 87,000 Indigenous people in Toronto. And now, because it's 6 years later, we actually estimate that there's about 90,000 Indigenous people in the city of Toronto. And this is really important. This having good research on Indigenous people in Toronto, knowing how many people are there in Toronto, how many people are experiencing racism, how many people don't think that there's adequate health care. So all of that research from Our Health Counts Canada, we used when we developed Adoje Mino Nasewanang. Adoje Mino Nasewanang means place of healthy breathing. And so what we did was we opened up a center, a health unit by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, where for COVID testing, for COVID support, and then a little bit later for COVID vaccinations. We wanted a place where Indigenous people felt safe. So in that Adoje, what we did was we started a research project. So it's a community-owned database about COVID spread, impact, and services in Toronto. So not only are we providing support for Indigenous people in Toronto around their health, but we're also collecting reliable data. So the Adoje had 3 community partners: Well Living House, which is an Indigenous research center out of St. Michael's Hospital. The picture of the woman with the baby is 7th Generation Midwives of Toronto, and they're an Indigenous midwifery center. And Namirez is Native Men's Residence, so it's a shelter for Indigenous men who are experiencing homelessness. And at the bottom is our logo for Adoje Mino Nasewanang, place of healthy breathing. So I will ask the question, but then I will answer it because I understand that the participants today aren't able to talk. So what was one reason for us to have reliable data on Indigenous people in Toronto before we started the Indigenous COVID testing and vaccination site? There was many reasons. One could be like, because we wanted Indigenous people to feel safe around getting healthcare because they told us that they didn't feel safe. But one of the really concrete reasons was, so we knew how many vaccines that were needed. So for example, the city of Toronto, using 2016 census data, said we only need about 23,000 or vaccines for 23,000 people. But in fact, we need vaccines for about 90,000 people. So that's why reliable data is very important and can affect the health and mental health of Indigenous people. So one of the really fun things that we did at Adoje was we tried to have fun events so that people would come in to get vaccinated. So we had a vaccine powwow at University of Toronto, and there's the TP. It was really fun. We had dancers, we had drummers, we had Bannock, and we had a lot of people, Indigenous people, come in to get vaccinated. So you can see there's the poster. I got vaccinated at Adoje. We have that picture actually at Adoje as well. So when people get vaccinated, they can stand by it and take a selfie so that we can encourage their friends, their relatives to also come to Adoje. So the other thing that I wanted to discuss is intervention research, so forensic psychology. So when I was doing my PhD, I really wanted to look at colonialism and overrepresentation. So why are there so many Indigenous people in the justice system? And, there's been a lot of research that says that Indigenous people are higher risk to become involved in the justice system. And so there's lots of studies that say Indigenous people maybe have more substance use difficulties, which can lead to justice involvement, or they have more trauma or mental health issues. And that in turn can lead to more risk to become violent or to do a crime. But what they weren't including was the context of colonialism itself. So my thing was to take a step back and say, well, how does colonialism affect substance use? How does colonialism affect mental health for Indigenous people? So it was like stepping back and looking at the background, at the context. So my goal was to understand pathways in the justice system. So how do Indigenous people, how do more of them end up in the justice system? Are there different things happening? Are there different pathways, different roads to get into the justice system? So this data that I'm showing you right now is actually from the government of Canada. Again, we don't have a lot of research done by Indigenous people for Indigenous people on justice disparities. So what I find really interesting, for example, is that in the justice system, I actually phoned Corrections Services Canada, and I said, how do you identify Indigenous people in the justice system? And they said, oh, we ask them. And I said, okay, when do you ask them? And they said, oh, when they first come into prison. I said, so the first day they're coming into prison where they're worried, they don't know what to expect, they might not have ever been in prison before, that's when you're asking them and you don't know them. And the woman said, yes. And I said, do you think that they might not be telling you that they're Indigenous? And she said, well, why would they do that? And I said, well, there's actually research that shows that Indigenous people, especially in prisons, don't get the same kind of treatment as non-Indigenous people. So for example, Indigenous people know that if they go into prison, they're probably not going to get paroled or let out early. So they usually do their whole sentence. So it's actually not good for Indigenous people that are in prison to say that they're Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous people might also say that they are Indigenous because they might think that Indigenous people get shorter sentences. So I actually think that the data that we have on how many Indigenous people in the justice system isn't that reliable. So that's maybe one of the things I will look at in the future. But this is what we have right now. So this data is from Corrections Services Canada, the Government of Canada. And we know that Indigenous youth make up about just under 10% of the whole youth population in Canada. But when we look at Canadian youth on probation, we find that 42% of the youth that are on probation are Indigenous. So that's 5 times higher. So that shows that there's overrepresentation of Indigenous youth on probation involved in the justice system in Canada. So I wanted to know why. Why are there more Indigenous youth on probation? So I've done a lot of reading on colonialism. I think that, oftentimes when you look at research articles and when they're written by non-Indigenous researchers, they're starting now to be a little better. So they might include in the introduction about colonialism, about residential schools, about land loss, but they don't really put those things in their research studies. So reading a lot on colonialism from the House of Commons, from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the Office of the Correctional Investigator, I found there is some research that shows colonialism is the cause of poverty. So to explain how colonialism causes poverty, we look at loss of land. So before colonization, Indigenous people had access to a lot of land. So they could hunt, so they could fish, so they could get the things that they needed. Because of reserves, now they have smaller tracts of land. We also know colonialism is the cause of food insecurity, for example. So this is because loss of hunting grounds, but we also know that food insecurity is linked to depression. So not having enough food or worrying about not having enough food can increase the risk for depression. Colonialism can also cause addiction because Indigenous people sometimes or might use drugs and alcohol to deal with historical loss. Colonialism is the cause of trauma and intergenerational loss. Colonialism causes disconnection from culture and language. Colonialism causes racism. So a lot of Indigenous youth experience racism. And this experiences of racism is connected to aggression. So being angry, maybe acting out violently. It's also, racism experiences is also related to feelings of depression. Experiences of racism is also related to school attendance because sometimes schools are the place where Indigenous youth experience the most racism. Colonialism is also the cause of physical, sexual, and emotional victimization. But the really interesting thing when I started to study colonialism specifically around justice or the justice system is that all of these factors caused by colonialism are connected to overrepresentation in the justice system and mental and physical wellness for Indigenous people. And a lot of these factors are left out of research. So let's say someone who does a study on addiction, but doesn't include colonialism, maybe experiences of being a residential school survivor. So they miss that whole piece. So when the treatment that they use for Indigenous people is probably, if they don't include colonialism, then that treatment might not work, or it might not work as well. So it's really important to start looking at colonialism and bringing it into psychology research. And that's something that I aim to do. So one of the things that I did before I started my research at Simon Fraser University is we did some community consultation. It's really important to ask the Indigenous community what they want and what they need in terms of studies. So, because that has not been necessarily done in the past. Oftentimes, non-Indigenous researchers would come into a community, do some research, and then leave. And nothing would change in the community, but there's all this research. And this research isn't accurate because it doesn't include colonialism, and it also doesn't include the Indigenous community. So what we did was we did interviews with 20 Indigenous youth justice workers in the province of British Columbia. And we also did interviews with 6 non-Indigenous youth justice workers. Those non-Indigenous youth justice workers had a lot of experience working with Indigenous youth. And what these youth probation officers said was that we need to look at other things besides the standard risk factors. So there's a list of standard risk factors like substance use difficulties, dropping out of school, having delinquent friends. So those standard risk factors were developed on mostly white male youth. But so when we asked these Indigenous youth justice workers and non-Indigenous youth justice workers, they said we should include factors that colonialism adds risk for. So things like victimization, parental addictions, violence in relationships, and look at how those things might affect Indigenous youth. So what I found was that a lot of the factors that the Indigenous youth justice workers talked about as being important were covered by the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, there's good parts about it and bad parts. So some of the good things is that there's been a lot of research. So that means that if I do a study using ACEs, then I can compare it to other studies that have also used ACEs. The bad thing is it doesn't include a lot of other colonialism factors like residential school attendance or racism. But what the Adverse Childhood Experiences Checklist does include is like physical abuse, physical neglect, having someone in the home with mental illness, experiencing divorce, etc. So what I did, which was very interesting, was I went into youth probation offices and actually read the youth probation files of Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. So to do that, we needed to get a lot of ethics approval from the university, from Youth Justice, so the province of BC. I also needed a lot of training on confidentiality, on how to use the computer system, and also what I could include and what I couldn't include. But, you know, going in, I would go in usually once a week for 3 or 4 hours and read youth probation files, and I learned a lot. So in that study, I had 187 participants. There were 50 Indigenous males, 47 Indigenous females, 40 white females, and 50 white males. So what I was looking for was how often they offended, if they reoffended after their charge, if they were Indigenous. I also looked for the 10 adverse childhood experiences to see if there were differences between Indigenous males and white males and between Indigenous females and white females. So I just included a little bit of statistics because, you know, one of the things about being an Indigenous psychologist is that sometimes non-Indigenous researchers think that all that Indigenous psychologists do is qualitative research. So qualitative research is interviews. So there's this idea, a stereotype really, that the only kind of research that Indigenous researchers can do is interviewing, so oral tradition. But I think it's very important for non-Indigenous researchers to know that Indigenous psychologists do know how to do statistics. Indigenous people have been using statistics for thousands and thousands of years. It's not new for us. So one of the things that I found, which I wasn't really surprised about, because there is some research that shows that having a history of colonialism, so being Indigenous, makes you more susceptible or makes you have more experiences of adverse childhood experiences. So for example, there's research that shows if a parent attended residential school, because at residential school, they might not have learned good parenting because they were away from their families, but they also experience physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, often for the very first time. So when those residential school survivors became parents, they weren't well equipped. They didn't have good parenting skills because they were taken away from their families when they were young. So what I found was that Indigenous females had the highest number of adverse childhood experiences. So on average, Indigenous females had close to 4 adverse childhood experiences, whereas white females only had an average of around 2 adverse childhood experiences. Indigenous males had 3.62 average experiences of adverse childhood experiences. So that's like childhood history of physical abuse, having a parent that had mental health issues, etc. And white males had 2.52 on average ACEs. So it's really interesting when you look at this, Indigenous males and females had roughly the same amount of adverse childhood experiences. And white females and white males also had roughly on average the same number, and it's lower. So then I wanted to know if Indigenous youth had higher rates of offending. So I split it up into any offending, which includes all kinds of offending. So like drug charges, let's say stealing, any offending also includes violence. But then I separated violence out by itself. And what I found was that Indigenous females had quite a bit more of all kinds of reoffending than white males, or white females, pardon me. And Indigenous males had a bit more experiences of any reoffending. But what's really interesting here is that Indigenous males had significantly more violent reoffending than white males. So you see 34% of Indigenous males in my study had violently reoffended, whereas only 12% of white males reoffended. So the unfortunate part of my study was that I didn't have access to colonialism. So what I really wanted to know is why Indigenous males, like what parts of colonialism put Indigenous males at higher risk for reoffending. But overall, what I found in my study is that Indigenous youth had higher rates of adverse childhood experiences and higher rates of offending, and that adverse childhood experiences do predict reoffending. So if you have higher number of adverse childhood experiences, then you're more at risk for reoffending. So the next piece would be for me to find out more about colonialism and why colonialism adds more risk for having more difficult childhoods. So another part that I really wanted to do when I was doing my dissertation was, so I can do all this research, but what I want to do is to bring this research back to the youth probation officers who are working directly with Indigenous youth. Because we wanted youth probation officers to be better trained so they can better support Indigenous youth on their caseloads and maybe understand colonialism a bit better. So one of the things that I did was I helped with the development of guidelines. So I did a lot of research. We also used the information from the Indigenous youth justice workers, and we came up with some guidelines to help non-Indigenous youth probation officers to work better with Indigenous youth. So one of the things that we developed guidelines around was simply having the youth probation officer ask the youth, the Indigenous youth, do you want interventions that include culture? Because sometimes they weren't even asking the youth this. And the second thing that I did was, alongside my supervisor, Dr. Jody Villon, we went around the province of British Columbia and we trained around 200 youth probation officers and justice workers on cultural considerations, and how to assess levels of cultural connectedness. So this is, how should I ask Indigenous youth in a respectful way if they want cultural interventions? And this is also, I also did some training on colonialism and how colonialism can contribute to risk in a different way for Indigenous youth than for non-Indigenous youth. So I talked to Jenna earlier today, and she said one of the questions that came up was, how can we decolonize the university? And the first thought that came to mind was that we have to be at university. I'm the first Indigenous professor in psychology at York. They're trying to hire more, and that's important. I think York Psychology, they're actually trying really hard. But to have an Indigenous psychology professor is really big, because now the Indigenous undergrads and grad students can see, oh, look, there's someone who understands. There's someone who I can talk to. There's someone who I can go to for support. So I think the most important thing to decolonize the university is for us to actually be there. And I think as an undergrad and as a grad student, it was difficult for me. But one of the things I did was I got a lot of support. So I would, talk to my Indigenous friends, tell them about my experiences. I went to the Indigenous Center at SFU for emotional support. So I actually went, they had an Indigenous counselor at SFU, at Simon Fraser University. And so I went to see her my last year when I was in school. And it was really helpful because I could talk about some of the experiences I was having and get some emotional support around that. The Indigenous Center was also really good because I met other Indigenous people and I could talk to them and I made friends with them. The Indigenous centers also have lots of resources. They usually have an elder that comes in at different times during the week and cultural activities. So the most important thing is for you to stay in university, because oftentimes, not always, but sometimes Indigenous students leave because they feel they're not getting support or they're experiencing racism. But that's why go to your Indigenous center, get some support there. So you want to be a psychologist. So one of the things I would actually start with is doing some homework. So I would Google different Indigenous student services at any of the university or colleges that you're thinking of going to. They will often have either a recruitment person or a counselor and an email address, so you can connect with them, email them and say, I want to become a psychologist. What do you suggest? So they can help you. They can give you some support around what classes you need to take, if you need financial support. So that's the first thing to do, is do some Googling. Look at universities where there's strong support for Indigenous students or colleges. Then you can Google some Indigenous psychologists. A lot of them are busy, but try emailing them and just ask them some questions. Most the Indigenous psychologists I know are very happy to help Indigenous students. So Dr. Amy Bombay, I think she's Anishinaabe, she is at Dalhousie, and she does a lot of really good research around colonialism, adverse childhood experiences, and mental wellness or mental health issues for Indigenous people. Dr. Lisa Monchalon is a criminologist as opposed to a psychologist, but she studies the justice system as well. And I think she is at Kwantlen University in Vancouver. She actually wrote a book about Indigenous people and criminology. And I like the title. It's the colonial problem, not the Indian problem, but the colonial problem. So it's a good place to look also is books. Dr. Suzanne Stewart is a Dene psychologist. She's at University of Toronto, and she's a really good resource. She's a clinical psychologist as well. So you can, Google them, look at what they're studying, see if it's something you'd be interested in. And if you do decide you want to go to grad school, you can maybe ask those psychologists or look on the website to see if they are taking grad students. But once you're in university, even when you're an undergraduate student, it's really important to try to join a psychology lab to volunteer. And when I was at York, I went to York for 2 years to get some psychology classes so I could apply for grad school. I was actually involved in 2 labs, and that was really important because you need 3 reference letters to get into most grad schools. So you need a psychology professor who knows you well. So a way to do that is to volunteer in labs. And you can do all kinds of different things. So when I was a PhD student, some of the undergrad research volunteers, they would help me organize files, or they would help me get information from youth probation files, or they would help me do some of the statistics, or they would help enter the data. So it's really a good way to learn, and also to learn more. Is this what I want to do? Am I really interested in psychological research, or am I really more interested in clinical psychology? So clinical psychology is more you're assessing and you're treating individuals. But as a clinical psychologist, you can do both. So work with individuals, do therapy with them, and you can also be involved in research. The other thing, which I also just mentioned, was to stay in contact with Indigenous Student Services. Make sure you have support. They can help you get in touch with people to learn more about what you need to do to get into grad school for psychology. And also try and find an Indigenous mentor. If there are Indigenous professors at the university, and maybe they're not in psychology, maybe they're in public health, or maybe they're in education, it still might be a good idea to volunteer with them, because it's good to have an Indigenous mentor. Because an Indigenous psychologist has a different understanding, because I know a lot about colonialism. I understand a lot of barriers that Indigenous students might run across, so I can talk to students about that. So that's why it's important to have an Indigenous mentor. When I went to grad school, both of my supervisors were non-Indigenous, but my first supervisor, his wife was Indigenous. So he knew a lot about colonialism. So he was very supportive. And my second supervisor for my PhD, she was also very supportive and very open to learning. But I think it would be easier if you could get a supervisor in grad school that is Indigenous, so they understand a lot of that unspoken stuff. But you can still do it with a non-Indigenous supervisor. Just make sure you have support. So I'm going to stop it there. I'm a little bit early, but I know that there are quite a few questions. So there's my email address there, mirn@yorku.ca. You can email me with questions. I will try to answer you back. Sometimes I'm a little bit busy. It might take a few days. But I also want to thank NAMIRAS. So Steve Teekins is the director there. 7th Generation Midwives of Toronto, Shirley Bourgeois is the director. Well Living House and Dr. Janet Smiley, Dr. Jody Billion, who was my supervisor in grad school, and the staff at Adoje Mino Nasewanop. So one of the other things that I didn't mention about Indigenous community partnered research is that the community owns the data. So before I talk to you today about Adoje, I talked to Steve, Shirley, and Janet to make sure that it was okay for me to share this information. So I will leave it at that. Miigwech. Yeah, so there's time for questions. Jenna?
Yes, Niao Goa, Dr. Muir, that was really, really interesting. We do have a lot of pre-submitted questions.
Sure.
And I'm trying to enter them so that you could see them, but I'll just read them out to you as well. Why do you think the government hasn't prioritized mental health for Indigenous people? And what can we do as non-Indigenous people to support?
Well, you know, I think there's a lot of good people in government. And I think there's some people who are really trying to make things better for Indigenous people. I'm not against white people. My father is white, I'm half white. But I think what happens is that a lot of people working in government, and even a lot of Canadians, don't understand that colonialism still affects Indigenous people's mental health. So that can be in the way policy is written. So an example of this is that Dr. Cindy Blackstock took the federal government to the Human Rights Tribunal, saying that Indigenous children on reserve were not getting the same funding as children off reserve. And it took 7 years for that to go through. And Cindy Blackstock won, but still the government fought against giving extra money and changing policy. And I think sometimes it does come down to they don't understand how colonialism affects us. And also, it's expensive. So one of the things we can do is, I think, like the research that I'm doing, and even the presentations that I do. So when I do presentations for non-Indigenous people, I talk about colonialism. I talk about policy. You know, as an Indigenous person, I didn't understand a lot about policy before. And so now when I'm looking at policy, I'm like, wow, like that's why, you know, so another example is, and I think this is changing, but on reserve, like schools that are on reserve get less money for education than schools that are off reserve. And the reason for that is because on reserve, it's federal funding, and off reserve, it's provincial funding. And traditionally, provincial funding was higher. So that's one of the reasons. So there's a documentary, it's quite long, it's 3 hours long. It's on the National Film Board, and it's called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. And it's actually about Cindy Blackstock taking the federal government to the Human Rights Tribunal. And it really pulls apart all the policy. So that really opened my eyes. So I think understanding how policy still affects Indigenous people, how the Indian Act still affects Indigenous people, really is the best form of advocacy. So, you know, sometimes I'll be at dinner with non-Indigenous people, and they'll say something about Indigenous people and why is there so much substance use, or why are they living in poverty? And I explain policy, and they're shocked. So I think that learning more is the answer. And, you know, Justice Sinclair, I think he had a really good point. So he was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he said, it's not just Indigenous people that the government lied to. The government lied to all Canadians. So we all have to learn. So that's kind of a long answer. But I guess my answer would be to learn as much as you can. Watch, CBC has excellent documentaries on Indigenous people. So it really can help you understand. So even like, I have a lot of books. So this is another one, Decolonizing Methodologies. And I can actually send some of the titles of these books and documentaries to Jenna, and she can hopefully get them out to you. This is another really good book for both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous. So it's Elements of Indigenous Style. So this is how to write about Indigenous people in a respectful and useful way. And the other book that I really liked for researchers, I think that high school students could read it too. I like this. So it's Indigenous Adolescent Development. And this is a longitudinal study. So it means it studies youth for a long period of time, Indigenous youth, and looks at everything like racism, experiences of racism, experiences of loss, historical trauma. So those are the kind of things you can do, is read, watch documentaries, and ask questions. I'll leave it at that. Jenna.
Oh, great. That's a really comprehensive answer. And for anyone that can see the chat, I was just typing in your references so that people just have it there. You can look it up later or take a screenshot or whatever. So, but yeah, I'd be happy to send out any resources. Anybody who needs any resources, just respond to the SciExchange email that was sent out to you guys today that had the link to this webinar on it. And with any questions you have after the fact, or you can email Nicole directly for any of the clarification on the resources as well. So another question we had submitted prior to was, what interests you in child psychology, and would you recommend this career option to other Indigenous students, and why?
Yes. What interested me in child psychology? I have always been interested in psychology. And then as I got older, I really got interested in culture. Like, why do different cultures have different ideas about the way they raise their children? Why do different cultures have different values? So for me, and also being an Indigenous person, I I wanted to bring that lens in. I knew, from working in Aboriginal child or Indigenous child protection and being an addictions counselor and a traditional counselor, I knew a lot of the issues that were coming up for Indigenous people when they were adults. And I also had experience working with Indigenous children when they were young. So I could see, oh, okay, so some of these, like the children I worked with were involved in child protection. So what I wanted to know, what got them from child protection experiences to having addiction issues as adults possibly, or being involved in the justice system, or just having trauma, a lot more trauma. So originally I wanted to do assessment. So I wanted to do IQ tests on youth. I wanted to do, because I didn't think they were being done well. I didn't think that they were including the context of colonialism. But to be perfectly honest, I did not have a lot of support as an Indigenous student. So I found that I was doing a lot of fighting and a lot of advocating. And when you're a clinical grad student, you're tired, you have a lot of work to do. So it was just a bit too much for me. So I think that's another important reason to have an Indigenous mentor or to have an Indigenous supervisor. But then I started to think, like, research is another way to help Indigenous children. And specifically, I'm really interested in intervention research, because intervention research, we find out whether an intervention worked, but we're also offering a service to Indigenous families. So it's kind of twofold. Like, that's what we did with Adoge. Not only were we giving them medical support around COVID, but we were also collecting information. So I thought maybe that's a better way for me to make a bigger impact, is to look at research. But actually now I'm going to apply for my psychological associate so I can go back to doing some therapy, because I do really like doing therapy with Indigenous community members. I think for Indigenous, you could also ask Jenna, I think we definitely need Indigenous psychologists. I was at Simon Fraser University, and that university was 50 years old, and there were only 5 Indigenous PhDs in psychology. And none of them were in clinical psychology. There are very few Indigenous clinical psychologists. We need them. We need them to understand our communities, to understand our people. So that's why I do think it's a hard road, but I think we're strong. Indigenous people are very strong. And if you reach out and get the right supports, you can do it. There's my pep talk. I don't know if you can hear my cat meowing, but she's meowing.
Yeah, great answer, Nicole. I don't know why I can't submit any more questions in the Q&A. I hope no one else is having this problem, but I just submitted them in the chat for you to see.
Okay.
Someone asked, how do we respectively and effectively create opportunities for students to learn about Indigenous knowledges in high school? And do you have any practical examples or resources?
Well, I think it's CBC has some curriculum. I could be wrong, but honestly, when I teach, so I developed a course at Simon Fraser University called Indigenous People in Psychology. And some of the comments I got from students were, this isn't a history class, it's a psychology class. But when you're working with Indigenous people, it is a history and psychology class. So CBC actually had some excellent documentaries. It's about catfishing, and the young woman is named Shelley Chartier. And I really like showing that documentary in particular because the first part of the documentary is filmed with a white lens. So the important things that maybe a white psychologist would look at or understand. And the second part of the documentary is if an Indigenous psychologist were looking, at Shelley Chartier's life, this can explain some of her crimes. So I like to show documentaries. I also really like Indigenous movies done by Indigenous directors. The problem is that sometimes they're very traumatic. So we have to keep that in mind. We can't, when I taught my class, I would say to my students, if you're Indigenous and you feel comfortable, email me because I'd like to check in with you. Because some of the stuff that I was discussing, they might have been hearing for the first time. So it can be very traumatic. So I think part of it is to really think about how you're going to support them. Because there actually is some research saying that the more Indigenous people learn about colonialism and learn about their culture, it can actually increase their levels of depression. Because when you learn more about your culture, you learn more about how much was lost. And that can lead to depression. So I think just being very careful, watching very carefully, thinking carefully about what you're going to get them to read, what you're going to get them to watch. But another resource is trying to get an Indigenous elder to come in and talk to your class. And when you do that, there are protocols involved. So you need to pay them honorariums and you need to pay them well, because elders are our university professors. So that's how we treat them. That's the respect we give them. They hold that much knowledge. So that's another way you can do it if you're non-Indigenous. So how do you find Indigenous elders? Well, you can phone the Friendship Center. I always say that's a good place to start. You can phone Indigenous agencies and say, I'm a teacher or I'm an Indigenous student and I want to learn more. Can I access an elder? If you are Indigenous, for instance, you could phone Anishinaabe Health and you can see an elder, but not if you're non-Indigenous, unless you're a partner of an Indigenous person, living with an Indigenous person, or have an Indigenous child. And that's so that we protect those resources for our Indigenous community members. But I think even if you're non-Indigenous, to educate yourself, so watch those documentaries yourself, watch those movies yourself, think about your biases. The problem with bias is they're invisible. They're invisible to us. But there's also, I forget what it's called. It's an Indigenous cultural training that you can take in British Columbia and in Ontario. You might need to pay for it, but if you contact them, of course the name isn't coming to me now, but I can again get that to Jenna. But if you just Google Indigenous cultural training in Ontario, it should come up. I think it's around $250, but if you are a teacher, like ask your school board to pay for it, or email them and ask, or if you're a student, they also have Indigenous cultural training for Indigenous people. So there will only be Indigenous people in your group. So there's lots of different ways you can learn yourself. All right, next question, Jenna.
Great. Excellent answers. You're overlapping on a lot of questions, so I'm trying to summarize them for people so everyone's questions get answered. But the next one was actually really interesting. Indigenous-based research methods within the colonial institution. And this person asks, how do we indigenize our thesis in university? I know that's a very broad question, but I think it's really interesting. You can answer, I guess, within the context of psychology or health if you want to make it easier.
So it's difficult to do because there are time frames. And we know that when you're working with an Indigenous community, it can take a long time to build relationships, and relationships are the most important thing. There's an article that I really like, and it's called You're Leaving, We Were Just Getting to Know You. And so it's about a non-Indigenous researcher telling the Indigenous community that they're finishing, that they're leaving the community. and the non-Indigenous researcher has been there for 10 years. So that's an example of how long it can take to build really good relationships with Indigenous communities, because there's mistrust of, you know, non-Indigenous researchers coming in the past and nothing changing, or non-Indigenous researchers taking pieces of their culture out, cultural artifacts. So there's all that stuff. Do the best you can. You know, when I did my master's thesis, I didn't do it specifically on Indigenous youth, but I did talk about some of the statistics about Indigenous youth. And my supervisor said, you know, you should publish your thesis. And I said, no, because I didn't do consultation with Indigenous communities. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have support around it. And I didn't have time to do it. So I did the best I could. But for my PhD, luckily, we did that consultation with 20 Indigenous youth justice workers. So that actually guided all of the research that I did in my PhD. But still looking back, it wasn't as good as I could have done. Like, so working with Janet Smiley and seeing the phenomenal Indigenous community partnered research she does, I look back at my PhD and I think, it was okay. But you also have to understand, as an Indigenous person, you just gotta do it and get out. Because once you're out, then you can do what you want. Then you can include the community. You obviously want to try to be somewhat community partnered, but don't be too hard on yourself if you can't. You have to be, you just have to look at it and say, okay, this is, you know, I got to jump through this hoop to get my PhD, and then I can do the research I want, and then I can do the research how I want to do it. So you have to be practical, and it's not easy. And I felt a lot of guilt, and looking back, I wish I would have done better, but at the time I did the best I could because I didn't have a lot of support. So just do the best you can.
Great. I don't know if you could see our previous panelist, actually, Corey Gray's comment about just an example of a thesis of someone he knew, and they had translated it to the traditional language. So, and he posted a video here.
That's great.
Yeah.
There was also, I don't remember his name, but he was Indigenous and he went to UBC and he did his whole dissertation without English grammar rules. So no capital letters, no exclamation marks, no periods. And he had a really hard time, but he got it accepted. So that was his way of fighting against colonialism in the institution. So there are ways. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Corey.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because for my master's thesis, I'm keeping the traditional Inuit syllabics and words within my thesis as well, instead of translating them into English. And that's kind of what Corey's saying, I guess, keeping that, you know, language and that sort of thing within. So that's a really good point. Thanks for that example, Corey. The next question. Okay, so this one's kind of a little bit more general for our students, but someone asked what looks good on a university applications, and how do we get more Indigenous people into university and specifically into psychology? I think you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe if there's anything you want to add that's a bit more specific.
So I think, unfortunately, at this point, a lot of it is grades. You need good grades. So how can Indigenous students do that? Well, I think tutoring is one way of doing it. So finding someone in the community who will tutor for free or who offers tutoring services, that's one way of doing it. The other thing is, like, for me, I had a lot of life experience, so work experience. It's interesting now, I was at the first clinical developmental faculty meeting, and they introduced me as the new psychology faculty who actually has experience in the real world, which is interesting because that just shows a lot of non-Indigenous people go straight from school, they go all the way through, and they don't have a lot of real world experience. So even when you're in high school, if you can volunteer helping other youth, or if you can volunteer working with children, or even some of your jobs, think about the jobs that you can do. Maybe you see if you can do some research, be a research assistant too, if there's research going on in your community. So having all of those experiences is really helpful. And I think it depends also on the universities you're applying to. Some universities are much more progressive in terms of trying to recruit Indigenous people. So for instance, some universities have a year of pre-university for Indigenous students so that they can prep them, get them ready to go into university. So maybe that's another route that Indigenous students might want to do, is do that pre-year of support. So that they usually work on their writing, they work on getting their grades a little bit higher, and offer all different kinds of support as well. So that's a really good option as well too. And I haven't looked recently. SFU used to do it. I think U of T does it, but you can, when you Google universities to see, that's a question you can ask the Indigenous Center at the university. Do you have a pre-year? Is there funding for me to do this pre-year? So I'd say that would be a really good way. So think about like any work experiences, any volunteer experiences, getting your grades as high as you can, getting into like a pre-university year to support Indigenous students.
Along with that, you mentioned getting to know or getting involved with Indigenous researchers or supervisors that are already at the university. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for the students who are maybe in undergraduate or even high school, thinking about how to even start doing this? Or is there any prerequisites you might need to have, or any advice on that process? Because I know that can be a little bit overwhelming. And I know some of the questions that were pre-submitted have a lot to do with, oh, how do I get started? How do I, what steps do I take? Who do I reach out to, or how do I know what to do to, put my best foot forward? So there's a lot of questions around that. I'm wondering if you could maybe summarize some of that information for us based on a little bit of what you've already said, but just to offer some extra help to our students who might be watching.
So one of the things I used to do when I was thinking about what labs I wanted to be involved with, I Googled all of the professors in psychology to see which ones had research interests that were the same or similar to mine. And then what I would do is I would put right in the subject, Métis undergraduate student. You want to catch their attention right away. If they're interested in having Indigenous students, they'll read your email. The other thing that I was actually told by a non-Indigenous professor was to say, I read your article, and found it really interesting. So praise them. Third, say what you're interested in researching, and what you'd like to do. Like you would like to be a volunteer in their lab. Usually what they want also is a CV, so your resume, and your grades. So again, your grades can be an issue because they're in some psychology departments, they're more strict than others. So they will only take volunteers in their lab if they have a higher average, but some of them don't. So so you want a short email saying who you are, what you're studying, that you read their article, that you're Indigenous, and then put your CV and your grades. And if your grades aren't as high as you would like, you can also, if you want, write a sentence about why. Like I I'm new to university and I've been finding it hard to get my footing because I don't know anyone. If you want, you don't have to. Some professors might not respond, and that's fine. You try not to take that personally. A lot of professors are very busy, or they have enough volunteers, but there will be some that do reply. And if you don't hear from them, email them again in 2 months or a month. You don't, and that's why it's good that the email's short, because you don't want to take up too much of their time. So don't send a really long email. They won't read it. Does that help, Jenna?
Yeah, no, it's just sometimes it can be hard to get started. So I understand where some of these, I personally understand where some of these questions are coming from.
Yeah.
So that's some good advice. One more question here. Is there an Indigenous psychologist group, network, society, and or other ways Indigenous psychologists can network and vent?
Yes, it's the Canadian Psychology Association has an Indigenous unit. I haven't, well, when you're in grad school, you're too busy to get involved in a lot of this stuff. But before grad school, I actually went to the Canadian Psychology Association conference, and I actually met with the Indigenous unit, and they were great. They actually gave me $500 to travel to the conference. So that's one thing you can do, is you can look up CPA or Google CPA plus Indigenous, and you should be able to get in contact with them. I know Dr. Suzanne Stewart used to be in charge of the Indigenous unit, but I don't think she is anymore. But that's a really good way of doing it. But yeah, I think that it's growing. I would be interested. I actually should look to see how many members are in the Indigenous unit at CPA. Jenna, do you know? Have you checked it out?
Yeah, I was actually a student member for a little while. I don't really know the status of that anymore because I know you have to keep it up. But yeah, my supervisor, Dr. Yvonne Bohr, recommended that I become part of that. And I think at the time there were only about 10 or 11 people, with roughly 50% of them non-Indigenous. So that's what I remember. That was from maybe about 2 years ago. I posted the link in the chat to the CPA, and their website is pretty comprehensive. So you can, anybody who's interested can review their policy and all that stuff that Nicole mentioned. So,
but you know what I found actually quite interesting at York University is there's an Indigenous council. So as soon as, actually the day of my interview, I met with the Indigenous Council for half an hour, just to introduce myself. But I'm finding I'm getting a lot of support from the Indigenous Council. They might not specifically be psychology, but they're involved in other areas of health or social work or gender studies. So they've actually been very, very supportive. So there might not be, there aren't a lot of Indigenous psychologists, but there are Indigenous faculty members who are, I think, banding together now to support each other and to make differences and changes in the universities.
yeah, definitely. Okay, well, from what I see, that was a lot of questions. So thanks everyone for submitting your questions. And thanks again to Dr. Muir for this very comprehensive presentation. It was, there was a lot of information, a lot of really great stuff here, and I hope some people got some of the resources that I posted. If not, again, feel free to reach out to me. Just reply to the email or email Dr. Muir. She's got her email posted here. If you need any of the resources or clarification on anything, we'd be happy to provide that for you. And yeah, that concludes our first speaker of April. Join us again every Saturday. We've got 3 more great speakers coming up. And we will see you soon. Everybody enjoy this beautiful weather and have a great weekend. Bye.